Thank you very much for the great invitation. I'm, in the meantime, retired. My name is Thomas Schnider. I probably have more fame in the intravenous anesthesia community, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the meeting which focuses on volatile anesthetics. I have to make some corrections to this first slide. I was 23 years, I was the head of the department in St. Gallen, Switzerland, but now since 1 year I'm retired, and I moved to the central part of Switzerland, to Engelberg, and I'm not doing anesthesia much anymore. I'm following some projects, but I live now in this place. This is a view from my balcony. I don't show pictures now from the hospital, and I hope that I won't miss a single day with fresh snow the next winter, which is coming up. I also, as I said, other things than pharmacokinetics. I work on my bucket list. Just recently I applied with a big supermarket company in Switzerland, Migros, as a truck driver, part-time truck driver, and that's my new challenge. I had one test day, and reversing this truck to the gate is a big challenge. So I'm working on other skills. Back to, I was given this title, and philosophically I agree, less is sometimes more. But in the context of pharmacology, more is not less. So probably we would have to express it a little bit better with more drug correlates with lower effect. That's what the drug titration paradox is about. Or I could also express it as drug titration turned pharmacology upside down, and that follows the title of a commentary or editorial which was published together with our original publication of the drug titration paradox in clinical pharmacology, written by Stephen Schaefer and Don Stansky. So I will talk about mostly about drug titration. That should be a bit the focus. And I have to admit that the previous speaker, excellent talk, Chris, I enjoyed it the second time, but my talk will also be a bit nerdy too. But I hope, and that's a sentence from this editorial from Stephen Schaefer, it's entirely obvious, this drug titration paradox. Like many things, it only becomes obvious once you see it, and I hope you see it at the end. So, classical dosing, just the dose-effect relationship, the sigmoidal curve, that's known to everybody. It's known from the Mack curve. You have the drug input, and in the context of my talk, it doesn't really matter whether I talk about dose, infusion rate, end-tidal concentration, the target concentration, that's effect site target concentration, or end-tidal concentration. It's always, when I use these expressions now during this talk, I interchange them. But it's clear when we classically give a drug, we choose some initial dose, and we expect some effect, and if we increase the dose, we get more effect, and up to some maximum, and that's a positive correlation. That's something, I think that's, for most people, for most doctors, and even for the patients, that's common sense. You get more, you receive more effect. When we analyzed data, about 6 years ago, clinical data from our department, we made an unexpected observation in clinical data. This was during an investigation analysis of data where we looked at the relationship between propofol target concentrations and bispectral index, and we looked for a bias with regard to some of the covariates, with the question, can we improve the pharmacokinetic model by including covariates better? And this was our observation. As you can see, we had the BIS and here the target concentrations, and when the BIS, higher BIS values correlated here with higher target concentrations. So less effect correlated with higher propofol concentrations. That was the observation with this study. And actually the first reviewer, or a reviewer during our first submission complained about this confusion here and recommended that for the following publication we should fix it. This is our data, this is the raw data. And we have a data management system, or we still have a data management system in St. Gallen which records the data every 10 seconds. It takes the data from the syringe pump every 10 seconds, at least every 10 seconds, and the BIS values. And these are several thousand patients, and we do anesthesia according to a best practice protocol, and everybody who administers anesthesia follows the protocol pretty well, as you can see. And this is the data, the BIS values, and we target the range of 40 to 60, and this is the range of target concentrations we needed to come into this range of. We selected the patients in order to reduce somewhat the heterogeneity of the data, and only took, when surgery lasted for more than 1 hour, patients had to be intubated, and BIS and TCI data had to be available. And for this analysis, we used the 30-minute value, sort of a maintenance value, because that's far enough from the beginning, you know, the instability, and still far enough from the end of surgery. Also, one of the reviewers said, no wonder that you get such a distribution of the BIS values if you have such a big distribution of the input. Basically, this reviewer was thinking that the higher concentrations were related to the low BIS values. But as I showed you before, it was the other way around. We had the higher BIS values were related to the higher concentrations. So if we had the same effect in all these patients, the spread, the distribution of the concentrations would have been even bigger. Now we had this observation, and it was clear we have to go look further into this matter. We looked at the database. There were more patients in the database, and we were up to almost 10,000 patients, and we still saw this relationship, predicted propofol concentration, BIS, negative correlation between dose and effect. And then we did some few patients with sevoflurane. Now we had a measured concentration. You know, you could say you could claim that it's just because propofol concentration is predicted something wrong, but here we had a measured concentration, end-tidal concentration, and again BIS, and we saw in these 1,000 patients, we saw the same negative correlation. Now, Chris probably would argue it's a problem of BIS, you know, don't trust BIS. We had to get, and I was thinking and looking through our database, another kind of effect. And an obvious thing was we looked at the norepinephrine, which is actually an infusion rate, versus mean arterial pressure in all the patients who got norepinephrine during the case. And now probably you have some clue what's going on. It's again a negative correlation. Patients with high norepinephrine have lower blood pressure. But you can, I mean, probably you suspect that here are the septic patients, and it's typical, septic patients high. And if you think that's in medicine in general, probably those with the highest insulin have still the highest blood sugar. So we had some idea, but we had to go, we had these 3 observations, and we crafted that eventually into this paper, the basic description of the drug titration paradox in clinical pharmacology and therapeutics, already 3 years ago. Now, what is going on? It's about titration to an effect which turns the pharmacology upside down. Already 5 years ago, at the ASA meeting, at the end, I met with Steve, I had my data, I was thinking of a little bit of a different kind of publications, and Steve showed the data, and Steve Schaefer said, COMP-B, And then second thought, could be, but we have to think about what is titration. And then he scribbled some notes on a napkin and said you have to come up with a simulation of titration. This is a picture of Steve last year at my farewell symposium in St. Gallen. I had Steve, Charles Minto, and Talmud Cheegan who were there. And Steve was also helpful in brainstorming the initial ideas of the drug titration paradox. So I went to the airport and started programming and came up with a simulation program for titration. I was thinking the algorithm for titration, and there are different aspects of titration. Eventually with titration, we want to have for all patients the same effect, let's say blood pressure of 70. But when we start with the same, in the same subjects, with same covariates. If we expect the same response, we use the same dose or concentration, target concentration. But we want to have all these individuals to have the same effect. Therefore, after the first dose, these subjects, they didn't get enough. These subjects got too much. So we have to reduce the dose in these subjects. And what happens when we start to titrate, the curve turns from the initially, the standard positive correlation to a negative correlation. As soon as we start to titrate, the correlation gets negative. If we are not happy with this, we keep further, we increasing the dose in these patients, reduce the dose, and we get eventually, our target is this effect, the overall or the average concentration effect relationship remains negative. We also included the idea we didn't need this, all the aspects of titration for the proof. We actually had in the original paper a mathematical proof by deduction why this correlation, when you titrate, the correlation becomes negative. Again, we have the sensitive patients and we have the resistant patients after the first dose, and we have, during dose adjustment, you have to go increase the dose in these patients, reduce the dose in these patients, because that's the goal of titration. And if you look at the average between initial dose and what our titration goal is, we get this negative correlation. So that's basically just make a long story short, the mathematical description. Here again, what is titration? Again, dose is concentration. With propofol, it will be an effect site concentration. We start with the same dose. We have the ones which are more sensitive and the resistant. Now the next step, we have to reduce the dose in this subject and increase the dose in this subject. We observe the effect again. We get better. We get closer to our target effect. We have to increase the dose even further in this subject and to get to the end. Now, the first dose is just a classical dose-effect relationship. It's just a sigmoidal curve, nothing wrong. But then later on, the target concentration is becoming dependent on the effect. Before, the independent variable is the input, and now the independent variable is the effect. There's actually a paper of Jamie Slay published before our publication about confounder variables. The clue behind the whole thing is also that, or in some instances, the sensitivity in patients has an effect on the effect, and it also affects also the dose or the input. And that's the statistical problem behind it, or is one of the problems. Now some misunderstandings briefly. Christensen and Agersol argued in a paper some time later, 1 year after our publication, that you could overcome the titration paradox by using a population approach. But at this time, we already had published a paper where we showed that the titration paradox also can be observed in individual data. We used for this analysis all data from our feedback control studies I was involved with in Bern, where we controlled the mean arterial pressure with a feedback controller with alfentanil. And interestingly, or it's somewhat obvious if you understand that paradox, we also observed that the patient with the higher blood pressure, when you control blood pressure with opiates, and this is what we are doing often clinically, that those with higher alfentanil concentrations have higher blood pressure. You know, those with a strong noxious stimulus, you can't just get the blood pressure down with even the high doses. So the paradox here shows up again, and it's anesthesia is not constant, it's not a stable situation, it changes. So the drug titration paradox is not caused by inter-individual differences alone. In sensitivity, it's also observed in individual data. And then just Ross Kennedy was involved with this comment to a review article in anesthesiology. We wrote a review article I think it was published last year. Basically, all the literature we had was our own literature, but anesthesiology was soliciting this review article. And then we had a comment from three researchers, and Ross Kennedy was also involved, and they argued that the titration paradox is a property of the anesthesia team, and they came up with a figure showing how a feedback controller would work and how an anesthetist would work. In our reply, we demonstrate that actually their example demonstrates the titration paradox. That was one thing. And as I mentioned before, we have shown in our with this analysis that the titration paradox also can be observed with feedback control. So the drug titration paradox is not an issue of who is controlling the input. It arises whenever the drug is titrated to a specific effect. Do not miss the titration paradox. I think many people still are doing titration studies and analyze the data as if it were dose response studies, as if the effect, the dose were independent of the effect. And just one of the example, just recently there was a publication about the influence of clinical and genetic factors on propofol dose requirements, and these authors came up with regard now to the clinical variable. They came up with a multiple linear regression model with clinical variables. And in the discussion, actually they observed that remifentanil doses, and they express it as predicted higher propofol requirements. That's not it's not prediction, but they observed that remifentanil correlates with higher propofol requirement and make some argument that this is against the previous finding and previous literature. And they go on and they write that, I have to go back again, that the observed connection is a titration paradox. The observed connection has nothing, the observed connection is not a titration paradox, and this sentence was without any citation, no reference, and I suspect that one of the reviewers mentioned that it could be related to the titration paradox, and the authors just pleased the reviewer and wrote titration paradox into the manuscript. But if you look at their multiple regression formula, it's propofol infusion rate, and you look at the state entropy, then it's indeed what we simulated this, Charles Minton and I, in our reply, or in our comment replied with a subject, just an example. That's what their observation was. With increasing propofol, state entropy increases. It's just a titration paradox, but the authors use the expression predict, and it's clear that's not the prediction. No study predicts that with 10 milligram per kilo per hour, patients are fully awake, and with zero propofol, except for Chris Conner's son, but with zero propofol, that's not what the model predict. probably it's better if we just look at the dosing range. You know, they were within this range, and this is the observation. It's just the correlation of more drug, and this is actually the drug titration paradox. They had the drug titration paradox there, and our comment to it is, you know, if not accounted for, the titration paradox could potentially weaken the statistical association between propofol dose and single nucleotide polymorphism. That's what they investigated, because their study goal was to have the same effect, and, you know, correlating this with the dose requirements. But these patients would have needed more drug and the others less, so the response probably would have been much stronger. So I come to the summary. The drug titration paradox arises whenever drug is titrated to a specific effect. Drug titration turns pharmacology upside down. More drug will correlate with less effect. And drug titration, that's important, is individualizing the dose. The dose is in titration dependent on the effect. And that's an important message. Data from titration studies should not be used as the descriptor of the dose-effect relationship. Thank you very much.